Okay, in this set of lectures, I'm going to talk through just one article from an American philosopher of the 20th century, Marjorie Grene. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of Grene's biography. So Grene was American, as I mentioned. She studied with the two most prominent schools of philosophy at this time. The school in Germany that known as phenomenologists and existentialists, particularly Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. So she took courses with both of those people in Germany for a few years, and then studied in the United States with some of the most important representatives of the positivist movement. These are also important figures in the history of analytic philosophy. So Grene basically was trained both in what's today called continental philosophy, which covers phenomenology, existentialism, and post-structuralism. It's called continental because it's based in continental Europe, that is the continent of Europe, rather than the United Kingdom. And also in what's today called analytic philosophy, which is the main philosophy that's taught and studied in Anglo-American universities, that is in, say, Great Britain, the UK, I should say, United Kingdom, and in the United States. So she studied with these two main groups. She was very critical of both pretty early on after studying with both the existentialists and with the positivists. She became very critical of both. So she didn't clearly affiliate with any of the main schools or teams in philosophy at the time, even though she was trained in them. She actually left academic teaching for about 10 years to raise children and run a farm. She did both those things with her husband at the time, who was himself a classicist. They moved to Ireland. They worked on a farm and raised kids for a while. And she returned to teaching in the 1950s and continued teaching until her death. And then her research productivity and publications skyrocket from the 1950s on. So it's interesting. She didn't really start a philosophical career until her 40s, until she was in her 40s. I mean, that's not true. She had earned a PhD earlier, and she had published a book or two, but she really started publishing a lot and teaching full time in the 1950s, when she was already 40 and 40 plus years old. From that point forward, she's known for her work on epistemology, which has been a major theme of this course, of course, and also on history of philosophy. And she wrote a lot about Descartes and a lot about Hume and other figures in the history of philosophy. About Aristotle, she wrote a whole book on Aristotle and a whole book on Descartes, for instance, studying them carefully. And she also is known for work on the philosophy of biology, which was a branch of the philosophy of science, which was really just getting going at this time. And today, Marjorie Grene is known as she's sometimes called the grandmother of the field of philosophy of biology, because her papers that were published in the 1950s and 1960s are some of the earliest contributions to this field. So she was really a kind of founder of the field in the 1950s and 60s. And questions in philosophy of biology include things like, what is a species? You know, that biologists classify organisms into species, but it's not, they use different rules to do that. And there are disagreements among biologists about what the best rules are to use to do it. And philosophers have tried to make contributions to that debate as well. There are debates about whether biology could ultimately be explained entirely in terms of physics and chemistry, or couldn't be explained entirely in those terms, that there's something kind of irreducible about biological phenomena and biological knowledge. So those are just two examples of problems in philosophy of biology. Grene wrote about those problems. The text we're reading is from her book called The Understanding of Nature, published in 1974. And in this book, she has many essays about problems in philosophy of biology. The subtitle of the book is, I think, Essays Towards a Philosophy of Biology, or something like that. So she had labeled her work as philosophy of biology in 1974, at least. And she's known to be fairly unusual and to not, her ideas don't easily fit into any particular school. She's kind of idiosyncratic in her thinking. So Grene's essay, People and Other Animals, begins with a question. She says, late in the 20th century, we still need to think through anew the basic principles of our view of nature and of man. Of course, by man, she means human beings, and especially of the relation between nature and man. So what's the question? The question is, what should be the basic principles of our view of nature and of human beings? What's the relation between nature and human beings? So what is nature? What is a human being? And what's the relation between those two things? And she also describes this problem as reconciling the manifest and the scientific image of man. And she's quoting another philosopher of this time, a famous analytic philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars, who had claimed that a big problem for philosophy in the 20th century, a problem that he also tried to address, is to reconcile the manifest and scientific images of man. The scientific image of man is what we have from the sciences. It's the way that biology describes human beings, the way physics describes human beings, physiology, anything that's a natural science. Like biology tells us human beings are animals. Neuroscience tells us our actions are determined by the state of a particular part of our brain. Physics tells us that we're composed entirely of physical matter. There's controversies and debate about exactly what it is that science says, or what we should take science to be saying about us. But the sciences are often offering us descriptions or explanations of our behavior, of us and of our behavior. And the question that Sellars is asking, and that Grene is echoing here, is how do we reconcile those scientific perspectives on what we are with the manifest image, which is kind of like our intuitive, everyday, common sense understanding of who we are. For instance, our intuitive, common, everyday sense of who we are probably involves the idea that we're making decisions all the time, and so are other people. But if our science starts to suggest that, well, no, actually our decisions are determined by our brains or by our genes, how do we reconcile those two perspectives? How can we make them compatible with each other? So that's the problem that Sellars sees there, and not just a problem about free will, but other descriptions of ourselves as well. Now, Grene lays out 4 possible responses to this problem, or these problems of what nature is, what man is, and what's the relation between them, or how do we reconcile the manifest and scientific image of man. She lays out 4 options, and 3 of these are very well-known options, and I've mentioned them on slides earlier. One is dualism. We can say that, well, human beings are composed of bodies, which are entirely natural, physical things, and minds, which are supernatural things, immaterial things that can exist after our bodies die. So, and that view, the dualist view, is supposed to partly explain why humans are so extraordinary and we can do some things that other animals seem not to be able to do. And, so there's the dualist perspective. There's a materialist perspective that we just are made of matter entirely. Our brains are made of matter, and if it seems like we can access something that isn't made of matter, if it seems to us like our thoughts are not just material things, well, that's an illusion of sorts. And if we do good philosophy, we'll be able to see that actually our experiences of red and our experiences of anger and love and so on, none of those experiences actually provide good reasons to think that there's anything in existence other than just matter. So that would be the materialist position. And that, in fact, was Sellars' position, as Grene notes. We can be idealists, that is, we can hold that our minds, or that, excuse me, that everything that exists is a kind of idea, a kind of, let's say, derivative of our experience, so that nothing exists except for what is already an idea or has the mode of existence of an idea or an experience. Or we can adopt this position that Grene wants to develop, which is unusual. It's not one of the canonical positions. It's not a well-known position. She calls it the theory of the eccentric position. And so this is the option that she favors, and she's going to argue for it a bit and say a little bit about its implications.